Section 15 of the treasure chest of my book house. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tavarish. The treasure chest of my book house. Edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. The Steamboat and the Locomotive. On the railway that ran through the city of Lig, there was once an English-made locomotive who was always discontented and grumbling. Nothing in the world was good enough for him, or at least nothing in the city of Lig. His coal was too hard or too soft, it was never just right. He hated to pull passenger trains because he had to go so fast, and he didn't like to pull freight trains because they were too heavy. He was always complaining that he was out of order, so that he might stay in the roundhouse and not work. He would shunt himself on sidings in hopes he might be forgotten. He was afraid to go over bridges for fear they would break down, and he hated tunnels because they were so dark and cold. He thought iron rails were too soft to get good hold on, and he said that steel rails were altogether too slippery. Sometimes he declared that he wouldn't run where there were not modern metal ties, and at other times he asserted that the old-fashioned wooden slippers made a much better roadbed. He quarreled with his tender, and he refused to be coupled up to one that he didn't fancy. He snorted and hissed at the semaphores and point signals, and he was a nuisance to the railway in more ways than can be told. But if he were bad, there was a young steamboat on the river who was worse. She was a very pretty craft, but that was no reason why she should insist on having a new set of paddle wheels every year. She was absurdly particular about her funnel, and if it were not painted the exact color that she fancied, she would declare that she would scuttle herself. She would roll and pitch with anger if they tried to back her. She would dig up the muddy bottom of the river with her paddles, and she gave a deal of trouble about steering. When these ill-natured creatures came together at the dock in the river, below the fortifications, they used to complain to each other till the cannon above them would cry, "Oh, I say!" and the bridge told them that they ought to be ashamed of themselves. One day, after the steamboat had been carrying a load of noisy excursionists up from the harbor, she found the locomotive on the pier in a very gloomy state of mind. "I am not going to stand this any longer," he said. "They've put me to hauling coal, and it's no work for a machine like me, especially when I can't burn any of it myself. I'm going to run away." "Well, that's a good idea. Suppose I go with you, and we'll set out together to seek our fortunes," said the steamer. They talked it all over, and finally decided to start that very night. The steamboat was to help the locomotive on the water, and the locomotive was to help the steamboat on the land. They were to share their wood and coal and water together, and have a jolly good time as long as they could. At midnight the locomotive got on board the boat, and she steamed softly up the river. "This is fun," said the locomotive. "It's all right for you," said the boat, "but I must say you are heavier than I thought. Wait till it's your turn to give me a ride. I can't go much farther anyway, the water is getting shallow. There is a dam up above here, so I think we'd better go ashore now." She climbed up the bank with the locomotive's assistance, and he then hoisted her up on top of his cab and set out across the fields. She was a little boat, but she was heavy, and the locomotive puffed away with all his might through the grass, stopping to rest once in a while. So they went on for several days, turn and turn about, for they had to cross several lakes on the way. After a while they began to approach a line of hills, and the ground grew steeper and steeper till at last the locomotive could go no further with the steamboat on his back. So she got off and scrambled along for a few miles with her paddle wheels, while the locomotive pushed her from behind. But the time came when neither of them could go a step further, and they lay on the ground exhausted. To make matters worse, they grew short of water and fuel. They cut down their rations to a ton of coal and a barrel of water a day, and even then they didn't have enough to take them back to either a forest or a lake. It seems likely that they would have to perish there on the hillside, and they quarreled with each other peevishly, each accusing the other of being at fault for suggesting this terrible journey. The old river Wob and the railway of the city or Lig had never seemed so pleasant before, but alas, it was many days' journey away. Just as they had begun to think that all hope was gone, one of them espied a dot in the sky. It grew slowly larger and larger. "It is a balloon!" they cried together, and they both began to blow their whistles with all the strength of their little steam that was left in their boilers. The balloon came nearer and nearer till it had got within hailing distance, and then they saw it was laughing almost hard enough to split its sides. It was a very fat, pink, round balloon, and as it shook with merriment, its basket swung wildly above them. "Well, I declare!" it cried out. "This is the queerest thing I ever saw. What in the world are you doing away up in these mountains? I never saw a locomotive or a steamboat on top of a hill before." "For heaven's sake, please don't laugh like that!" cried the steamer. "But come and help us before we perish." The balloon finally consented to give them assistance over the mountains, and let down a rope, which the two tied around their waists. The balloon then rose, and the locomotive and steamboat were hoisted high in the air, and they all sailed away towards the east across the range of mountains. They had floated for half a day in this way, when the balloon gave a pull up a little harder than usual, and the rope suddenly broke. Down went the two, falling faster and faster through the air, and they both thought that their last moment had come. But by good luck they happened to fall in the middle of a large forest, and landed safely in an oak tree without breaking a piece of machinery. Yet they had after all escaped one danger only to fall into another. They were lost in an immense wilderness, and did not know in which direction to turn. The locomotive finally succeeded in climbing a tall tree, and made out smoke rising in the distance. To this they painfully made their way, and after a terrible struggle they drew near, rusty, scratched, and smoky, and came to an old sawmill by the side of a little stream. It was a hideous old mill, of a villainous aspect that alarmed them both. But here was their only hope, and though they were far from any assistance in case of danger, the two unfortunate machines found themselves obliged to apply to the mill for shelter and fuel. The mill welcomed them very hospitably, but there was something in his dusty, oily manner that the locomotive did not trust, and he resolved to stay awake and watch. The little delicate steamboat was by this time too exhausted to notice anything. After they had drunk many barrels of water each, they revived a little, and the mill offered them a few tons of sawdust, which, he said, was the only fuel he could give them. At the first trial the steamer whispered to the locomotive that it tasted queerly, but they decided it was only the oil in which it was soaked. At any rate, they had to eat that or nothing, and they made a meal of it without more ado. Hardly had they burnt the last mouthful, however, before they both fell into a heavy sleep, and knew nothing for many hours. The locomotive was awakened by a sudden pain, and he was terrified to find the teeth of a buzz saw cutting through his side. He sprang up with a roar, but it was too late. His left side wheel had been bitten off. He charged furiously at the sides of the mill, and tore open a great hole, then dragged out the steamboat and ran her into the forest as fast as his 5 wheels could carry him. The mill steamed and shrieked after them as they hurried away. As they stood trembling in the forest, and thanked their stars for such a narrow escape, a sudden glare of light attracted their attention. The mill was on fire, set no doubt from some sparks dropped by the locomotive in its terrible struggle for escape. By the light of the burning mill they made their way through the forest all night. With new fuel and water their strength had been partially renewed, and terror increased their efforts. In the morning, after a short sleep, they awoke to find themselves by the side of a wide river, to which they had hobbled during the night, but had not seen in the dark. Alongside the bank of the stream ran a beautiful level railway line. They looked and looked, hardly able to believe their windows. It was too good to be true. It did not take them long to decide what to do. The little steamboat gave one leap into the river and whistled long and merrily. The locomotive crawled onto the line and rang its bell in a joyous peal, for they knew by the looks of the country that they had been traveling in a huge semicircle, and that the river and the railway led directly into the city of Leg. So they steamed along, side by side together, the lame locomotive and the sorrowful, shamefaced steamboat. That day one laid her head at last alongside the dock, and one puffed timidly into the station. Both decided never to complain of any work that they should have to do in the future. End of section 15.